Thank you so much for coming to hang out with us today. Hopefully you guys can all hear me. Hopefully John will get me another mic because I am physically incapable of standing in one place for an extended period of time. My name is Selena Larson.
I'm Joe Wise.
And we are super stoked to talk to you today about how crime finds a way. I wanted to get started off with this quote because I feel like it really truly encapsulates what we're seeing across the cybercrime threat landscape. And it's by the guy who actually wrote Jurassic Park. Living systems are never in equilibrium. They are inherently unstable. They may seem stable, but they're not. In a sense, or everything is moving and changing, and in a sense, everything is on the verge of collapse. I really feel like this encapsulates what we're seeing across the cybercrime threat landscape. And it all really started with a macro extinction event. A couple notes on the data and methodology that we're looking at. All of the stuff that we're talking about is based off of campaigned threat data that is manually contextualized and analyzed by threat researchers, so there is a little bit of bias. I do encourage you, if you're interested in the full methodology, to take a look at our paper that was also published. But macro extinction event. As you can see, in 2021, there were nearly 700 campaigns that were using both VBA and Excel4 macros. That was very, very common prior to 2021. That was the go-to tool or technique that most of the cybercrime threat landscape was using. Those macro-enabled documents that when you clicked on them, enable macros, bam, you got infected with malware. And then all of a sudden, in 2021 into 2022, Microsoft announced and then ultimately blocked macros by default. So the one-click wonder, ease-of-use macro-enabled documents were no longer super effective. And you can see the use across the email threat landscape tanked, dropped 66% in 2022, and then barely made a blip on the threat landscape here in 2023. So what does that mean? Well, we're seeing a new pattern that has emerged across the threat landscape. The cybercriminal ecosystem has really just experienced this monumental shift in activity and threat behavior that we really haven't seen before. Threat actors that use email to deliver malware are having to change things up. They're having to experiment. They can't use their old reliable macros anymore. So they are trying to find new ways of doing things. And so the static predictable attack chains, that one-click macro, etc., just doesn't work. And now we're seeing really dynamic and rapidly changing attack techniques. And I'll hand it back to Joe to talk about some of that.
All right, yeah, so through our research, we've observed threat actors just change things up a little bit and experiment and follow each other or copy each other. And this is not a new phenomenon. We previously published research back in July of 2022 describing some of these changes and following the leader or copycat syndrome. They would use container files such as ISOs, IMGs, VHDs, or even Windows shortcut files to distribute malware through campaign data. So why follow the leader? Why copy each other? Why follow that list of the Lambo list, you know? Everyone's copying each other. Well, first, they might be ditching their old attack chains and going with new behavior. Maybe it works better. Or the whole homework concept. Sorry, didn't do my homework. Can I copy yours? Or reducing the testing and development time, especially if the attack chains involve multiple stages. Or sharing is caring. Maybe they're just sharing services or technologies. So HTML smuggling is an example of follow the leader. Now, HTML smuggling is not new. It's been around for a while. Even Async Rat, NJ Rat, aka New Jersey Rat to some, and other malware have used this since 2021. And this really picked up pace after the experimentation with container files. And within Proofpoint data from June 2022, it really increased dramatically thanks to the large campaigns from our friends TA570 and 577, the initial access brokers, distributing QBot. They are, you could say, trendsetters. Maybe they're with their Montclair coats or the Aviator Nation gear, but they're setting the trends typically, and then other actors tend to follow suit. For example, TA558 and 578, sure enough, in September and October, began joining the HTML smuggling party and distributing iced ID. And through this technique, it dipped slightly in January, but picked back up again in February and March. PDFs in attack chains are another example of follow the leader, or I forgot my homework. Can I copy yours? We've seen multiple initial access brokers leverage the PDFs starting in December of 2022, and then a huge increase since then. Just like inflation has increased, you got PDF increasing, so you could call it PDFlation. PDFs are everywhere. We've seen PDFs since day one throughout the landscape. Various different threat actors have been using this technique. But what's interesting, how threat actors basically adopted, kind of front-loaded the PDF stuff to their things that they learned earlier in the year. So for example, like a typical QBot or an iced ID campaign would start off with PDF, then go to a URL, then go to a zip password-protected container file, and then you would have like a happy meal of sorts of different things, different scripts and mechanisms to ultimately land to QBot and iced ID. And then just a quick note, almost forgot. Memory Lane, Emotet, they started off with PDFs back in 2017. So PDFs have been around for quite some time. But they quickly shifted to Microsoft Office documents. And then just a quick note about the spike of unattributed campaigns in the January-February timeframe. We saw a spike in unattributed Brazilian banker malware during that time using PDF files. Okay, so this was a weird anomaly that we noticed in April. The initial access broker TA570 distributing QBot, but they were playing around with or were experimenting with PDF encryption. So the PDF files would actually show encrypted, and some of the tools were not able to parse those URLs. But it would work regardless. So a user would be able to click on the open button, redirect to a URL, to a zipped WSF file to deliver QBot. But it underscores how TA570 is just in this experimental mode. So another example of follow the leader, hey, I didn't do my homework, but can I copy your attack chain, is involving Kataro TDS. Kataro Traffic Distribution System is basically a legitimate software that allows you to direct traffic through operator-controlled servers, and it will allow a threat actor to redirect to malware downloads or to implement some type of filtering to deliver a payload or not to deliver a payload. So March, April, and even May, we saw multiple threat actors basically use the same exact attack chain, delivering iced ID and Bumblebee. So essentially it starts off with an email, URL to a PDF or PDF attachment. Within that PDF contains a URL that redirects to Kataro TDS. If the check's passed, that gets redirected to a zipped executable, and then voila, you get either iced ID or Bumblebee. And due to the similarities for this attack chain, we think it's likely that they're all sharing the same service. And then we talked about trend setting earlier. So can async rat be a trend setter? Maybe, maybe not. But we did see async rat in December of 2022 distribute through campaigns using OneNote files. And then by January, there was a rapid adoption of OneNote files. In fact, over 3 months, we saw over 120 campaigns, various different malware, various different attack chains, leveraging OneNote files. Notably, TA570 and TA577 and 581, they synchronized all on the same day. Late in January, they started using OneNote files. And then again, February 1st, February 3rd, February 8th, they were definitely in sync and in concert. So guess who didn't get the OneNote memo? TA542, aka Emotet. They were a little late to the party, maybe a long winter break for them, but they started using OneNote files in March timeframe, and they just couldn't shake the Office files. In 2 campaigns, they used OneNote files and Microsoft Office documents.
Emotet is really chaotic. So, so I wanted to talk about the relationship between threat actors and defenders. We hate them, but we need them. Basically, it's a symbiotic relationship that we have. And this is really exemplified pretty well by all of the OneNote chaos that like super blew up on the threat landscape in January and then kind of trickled off. So I want to share a quick story time, the OneNote Tiger team at Proofpoint. I jokingly called it a Tiger team, and then people actually started calling it a Tiger team, but it was just a bunch of us that got together, and they're like, wait a second, we're seeing OneNote all over the place. So we had our threat researchers, threat hunters, detection engineers, and folks from emerging threats all taking a look at this explosion across the threat landscape of async rat campaigns that were using OneNote. We were looking at the documents themselves, the scripts used, the size of the button that says open, which like progressively got so large that you're like, no one could possibly think this was a real button. But we were very, very early on where we were catching that stuff, writing detections for it, writing a OneNote file parser, creating a lot of these defenses so that by the time TA570, TA577, and TA581 started using OneNote documents, it was kind of ineffective because basically we had put all these defenses together. I know there were some folks in the community that were also working on this, releasing some open source tools as well to really combat the OneNote vibes. So that kind of is evidence of the sort of cyclical relationship that we've got going on. You know, once new behaviors are identified, we all got to create new rules, detections, try and figure out what these trends are to really improve defenses for our customers and for people using the internet in general. But the downside of this is once a technique becomes well known, it becomes less effective because we're doing our jobs. But that forces the threat actors to be like, wait a second, I got to think of something new to bypass these detections and figure out what's next. So we see a big decrease in OneNote driven by a lot of different things, but largely because people started paying attention for it. We were ahead of the game, reacting very, very quickly to this new technique that was used. There we go. I said Emotet was chaotic, but really all of the initial access brokers are pretty chaotic. Based on Jackie's conversation, it sounds like they're like totally fine. They're still making money, but, they are also having to iterate really, really rapidly and try and figure out what the heck they're doing to be effective at delivering malware via email. So just by way of summary, these ransomware operators will buy access from these groups that are gaining initial access. And from our perspective, that is very much in the email threat landscape. And then, of course, those guys then sell to the ransomware operators. Sorry. Great. So TA570 has been mentioned a couple of times. It is one of the most prolific Ecrime actors and Qbot affiliates. Many of you might know them as the president's threat actor because they use president names in their bot ID, such as Obama and Biden. And largely before 2022, TA570 was all about the macro, which is pretty common for most of the initial access brokers. They loved it. But 2022 came around and they're like, wait a second, this actually isn't going to work anymore. We might actually have to try something. So as Joe mentioned earlier, there was that pivot across the threat landscape to container files, ISO shortcuts. You can see here that a lot of times they were used in concert. So the attack chain might vary, but they might be using kind of similar file types to try and figure out, okay, which works best and which will have a higher likelihood of a user like clicking on it and then clicking on something else and then clicking on the final thing that will actually execute the Qbot malware. But we have associated TA570 with some black box or ransomware campaigns as well as some others. This is largely due to open source and information sharing. So thanks to all the community who has been so amazing at documenting and tracking these initial access brokers, as well as the ransomware threat actors, because this is a team sport. But where it gets really crazy is November, December, and into 2023. They just started kind of doing a little bit of everything. They started using PDFs, HTML smuggling, OneNote. I think there was an Excel admin file in there somewhere. But they were like, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to try a bunch of different things. And they kind of changed up their kind of consistent TTPs to go a little bit crazy. This is really evidenced by December 2022, their activity. They used as many as 6 distinct, unique attack chains. This isn't necessarily super high, but it is pretty, that is quite a few attack chains. And what's interesting is sometimes they might change in the same day. Or, you know, one day they're doing one thing and the next day they're doing something else. Sometimes it's weekly, sometimes it's monthly. But they are very, very rapidly iterating and changing things up. So in this example, they always start with thread hijacking. These 3 examples are using HTML smuggling to a password-protected zip. But then that's where things get different. So it might be an IMG or VHD file. And then within those, it might be a little bit different. So it might be a shortcut to a CMD to a DAT file. Or if they were feeling extremely lazy, which, I mean, same, it's December, it's the holidays, we're just going to include a shortcut in the zip. And then that's not all. They also use PDFs. Again, we talked about how PDFs are becoming a very popular vessel for malware delivery, using the typically containing a URL leading to some badness. In this case, both led to a password-protected zip. And then again, it might change based on an IMG or an ISO. And then within that, either a script file or an LNK that ultimately led to QBot. Okay, Ice ID is my favorite. Especially recently, I've been looking into this a lot. And shout out to the team who's been working on this as well. Ice ID is crazy. But it's considered an initial access malware. We do see it associated with some ransomware. And we have 7 tracked threat actors and multiple unattributed threat clusters that do use this malware. That's hundreds of campaigns across our threat data. And pre-2022, macros were largely used for malware delivery for anyone that was using Ice ID as well. There was some anomalies, for example, JavaScript files that were used to deliver it, but for the large part, it was macros. They actually jumped on the threat actors that were using Ice ID jumped on the let's not use macros and something else early. So in early 2022, they started experimenting, again, very much with those container files and the shortcuts, etc. And then things get wacky and weird in the fall of 2022. Again, kind of aligned with QBot, but a little bit crazier. So they started using a lot of different attack chains. And what was kind of cool here too is while the threat actors that were using Ice ID, which many of those are initial access brokers, so they were using like a variety of different file types and TTPs for the actual like malware delivery. At the same time, the Ice ID malware was going through a lot of chaos and confusion. So the code itself was changing. Proofpoint actually identified 2 new variants of Ice ID, including a forked variant and a light variant that was dropped by Emotet. And these basically ripped out the banking functionality, operated exclusively as a loader, contained a lot of really weird code. And the Ice ID, the standard Ice ID loader too, started kind of like seeming to be a little bit lazy. Like they had some weird bugs in their code. They had some fewer checks to see if this was a researcher or not. So as the Ice ID malware was going through all these changes, the landscape too, the threat actors were also changing their behaviors and delivery methods. So all across the threat landscape, you see a lot of weird vibes, I guess is the best way to say it, and in large part response to trying to figure out what works best to deliver malware.
All right, shifting things up a little bit. Ooh, back. Targeted cybercrime. So Proofpoint defines targeted cybercrime as those with a narrow focus on geography or vertical. And in general, targeted cybercrime and commodity malware is kind of basic. Their attack chains are simplistic. Their version of a container file is basically stuff and executable in ISO. And like detection is almost like a T-Rex blowing off your hat, kind of easy. But these groups may not have the skills or resources to throw at it like the initial access brokers do. And what's interesting, some groups have completely ignored macros, while other groups have used them a little bit and then shifted to other things. I'll highlight 2 groups. First one is TA558. It is a small crime threat actor that goes after hospitality, travel, and hotel organizations. And as you can see on the chart, they shifted away from macro into experimental mode. And they are trying to find a different way of container files, ISOs, shortcut files, helper files, anything that they can do to compromise a box. Even they brought back CHM files, the old school CHM files. But they are no stranger for diversification or switching things up because they have a wide array of malware that they distribute. So for example, they'll do VJ Worm, Loader Rat, Revenge Rat, even recently Async Rat and Venom Rat. The Venom Rat was kind of interesting because they had a BotConf talk that was really interesting. But despite all of them switching up different ways and methodologies, they remained consistent with their targeting and their email lures. Their email lures are usually on reservation themed or hotel booking themed. Another group, cybercrime group is a small threat actor, is T2721. They're more or less like the one-trick attack chain pony, you know, with the dinosaur with the flippy thing. That's their only trick. So the award that goes to like the most boring or the most consistent attack chain goes to these guys. So we've tracked them since 2021. The same TTPs over and over again to deliver Banduke. They mainly target Spanish-speaking users and organizations globally, but the attack chain goes, they have an email with a PDF or a link to a PDF. Within that PDF contains a URL shortener, maybe two. They switch things up just slightly. And then that goes to another URL, which hosts a password-protected archive, either a RAR or a zip file, and then that ultimately lands to Banduke malware. This group also gets the award for having the worst OPSEC. So they do not change their password on the archive all too often, and it might be 12345 so that's kind of bad. And then also the award for longest standing C2 infrastructure. They'll keep it for months, even years at a time. With that.
Yeah, so what does this mean for the threat landscape and for like defenders and for security people? Like, what are we seeing? What does this shift mean for us? Well, basically the experimentation and pivoting to new TTPs is vastly different from attack chains that we've observed prior to 2022. This is the new normal for cybercrime activity. There isn't the go-to, very easy, like macro-enabled documents that threat actors are super reliant on anymore. That just doesn't happen. They're trying everything. It's a little bit throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks, while at the same time trying to figure out how that spaghetti can bypass existing detections. While simultaneously having to really think about social engineering. They have to get people to engage with longer, more, not sophisticated, but more intricate attack chains. So a user isn't just enabling macros, but they're having to click on a URL, download a zip file, enter the password, download an executable. And at each stage in that attack chain, there's an opportunity for that user to be like, wait a minute, this is a little bit weird. So from the social engineering perspective, the threat actors have to have very convincing lures. And then the rapid rate of change for many actors indicates they have the time, capability, and understanding of the threat landscape to be able to do this. It's not necessarily all of them, but certainly with TA570 and TA577, for example, a lot of the initial access brokers, it's very clear that they have their finger on the pulse of the threat landscape. They are seeing what's working, seeing what isn't, and many times really blazing the trail for other threat actors to be like, oh, okay, I see that this is, what this actor is doing. Maybe this works. Let me try it myself as well. But you can see with just the rapid iteration and the changes that even month over month that we're seeing with these threat actors, they're very clearly investing the time and resources into figuring this stuff out and seeing what works. They can't just like sit back and use macros anymore. So sorry about that. And then finally, the pace of TTP adoption forces us as defenders to really try and understand new trends and actor behavior and basically create detections and respond to those changes in the threat landscape a lot faster and more frequently than we had previously. So while very consistent actor behavior, we can see it and know that we're good. When something new happens, we have to be very, very fast at creating detections, creating new tools or resources to be able to combat that activity. Because based on our research, we know that if a TTP is used by one actor or a cluster of threat actors, it is very, very likely that that is going to be used widely across the threat landscape. That's all we have. I did want to highlight some shouts and greets. This was a team effort at Proofpoint, especially Kelsey, Tommy, and Pim. You guys are awesome. The emerging threats team is working on creating the network detections for all this weird stuff that we're finding in email. And of course, the OneNote Tiger team. They were so great. And that's all we have. We're also sticking around the conference. So if anyone has any questions that they think of later, by all means. Also, these slides are going to be available. So we'll share the links as well. And we also published a paper on this that is available on Proofpoint's website. So there's a ton more information in there and you can read more about our research. Thanks, guys.